And now for our speakers this evening. We are thrilled to first be joined by Reginald Chapple, the Division Chief of the Office of Partnerships and Philanthropy at the National Park Service. He has 10 years of service with NPS. He's responsible for all national strategies related to partnerships and philanthropy, branding, marketing, donors, you name it, across the NPS, and has also had significant leadership roles across a number of other groups, including as a mayor-appointed South Los Angeles Area Planning Commissioner and a member of the Los Angeles Historical Cultural Resource Inventory Survey Advisory Board. He has a PhD in sociocultural anthropology at UCLA and has an established academic center and served as the first West Coast Center Director for the Southern New Hampshire University School of Community Economic Development. He is joined by our other fantastic speaker, Tyrhee Moore. Tyrhee is a mountaineer and outdoor education advocate, born and raised in Southeast Washington, D.C. Moore, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for about 15 years through our mutual love of the outdoors, is an alumnus of West Virginia University and is a highly regarded outdoorsman whose climbs, which I cannot call also my climbs, include Grand Teton, Mount Kilimanjaro, and the first all-African-American climb of Denali. Following his second ascent of Denali in May 2017, he garnered national attention for bravery and leadership as a champion around advocacy amongst Black youth in outdoor spaces. He holds a range of accolades to his name, but in particular to our conversation this evening, in November 2018, founded Soul Trak Outdoors, a nonprofit organization connecting urban communities of color to our planet's green spaces. In addition to his career and volunteer work, he's involved in a number of national advisory groups. And our moderator this evening, we are delighted to have our fellow colleague from Harvard University, Marya T. Mtshali. She is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Technology and Social Change Project at the Shorenstein Center here at the Kennedy School, and a lecturer in women, gender, and sexuality at Harvard University. Additionally, she's taught classes at Wellesley College and Clark University. She received her PhD in sociology from Boston College. She's currently completing her book manuscript for Invisible Terrains, Race, Gender, and Heterosexuality in the Lives of Interracial Couples. Her work has been published in a range of spaces and peer-reviewed journals, and her sociological writing has been featured in The Nation, Vox, and Cosmopolitan. Her op-ed, The Great Outdoors, was socially engineered for white people. We'll talk more about that tonight. Was published in The Nation in May 2021. Again, thank you so much for being here post-spring break. We're glad you can make it, and I'm delighted to welcome our speakers to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. I think this is a great time to be kicking off this conversation. Spring is here, it's warm, we want to be outside. We've been cooped up a little bit, and so, and I know I definitely want to myself, but we also know for some groups of us, the being outside in the outdoors is a little bit more complicated. So that being said, let's jump into this. So this is a question for both of you. We can start first with you, Reginald. Why does this matter? Why does race matter when we talk about the great outdoors? In what ways do we see structural racism play out when talking about outdoor space, historically and currently, whether we are talking about national, state, local parks, as well as just in general nature and outdoor space?
Sure. Thank you for that question, and thank you all for having me here today. And on behalf of the National Park Service, I just want to say thank you all for being here and for us to be able to have this conversation, because I think it's really important. When we think about, I'll answer this question from the perspective of the National Park Service and public lands. And it's that word public. These are our tax dollars, that means everyone's tax dollars, that go into these spaces. And that means that they should be accessible to everyone. And historically, that just has not been the case for the National Park Service. I mean, it starts with the beginning of the National Park Service and the way in which the country was organized at the time. And the structural racism that was there actually gets reflected in the National Park Service. And so we can see that in places like Yosemite. I was just having a conversation earlier about the Buffalo Soldiers, which is not often talked about when you talk about the Civilian Conservation Corps. And so there's these places that have these stories that we need to really be able to both document, which we do in the National Park Service. So we both interpret and commemorate these spaces, but we also use that history to actually talk about these things in modern times. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The National Mall, so the Lincoln Memorial. We know that as being important to a couple of events, right? So Marian Anderson, 1939, she can't go to the Daughters of the American Revolution because they are denying her to be able to sing opera there. So Eleanor Roosevelt actually talks to the Secretary of the Interior, who's in charge of the National Park Service, and we have her sing on April 9th on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. This is also a place where, in 1960, we've got Martin Luther King Jr. And the March on Washington, and the I Have a Dream speech happens there. And so these are moments of structural racism being broken down, and it's also a place where we have First Amendment rights that actually are on display every day there, where you can go and you can protest, and you can speak your mind in this space. It's like the nation's living room. So it's both a commemoration space and interpretive space, but it's also a living space, a laboratory where we get to continue these ideas of democracy and democratizing public lands as well. And that's the work of the National Park Service that you can't quite see. It lands differently sometimes, and that it doesn't feel like it's accessible. But what we try to do is we try to actually work with local populations that are around the park and work on that diversity to make sure that it happens. And I'll be glad to talk more about what the Biden administration is doing now with Executive Order 13985 on race and social equity, and then also Executive Order 14008, which is around climate resiliency and environmental justice. And you know, environmental justice is related to breaking down structural racism as it relates to ecosystems. And so the other part you can't see, and I'll close here, is our equity action plans that we're working on. And these are related to DEIA and outdoor recreation. And so this is the stuff that's at work that we're trying to get out pictured in parks based on the history that we have in the United States, but bringing it more to a contemporary focus and making sure that we provide access to current populations.
Thank you so much for that. And we will definitely be coming back to both those acts. I want to hear more. Tyrhee, do you also want to add to this?
Yeah, I think similar to a lot of what Reggie said, there's so much significance on the topic, primarily because I think it plays both on some of the institutional issues that we've been dealing with since the very foundation of the creation of the national parks, but how that also intersects with issues around climate change, right? And how those two issues are going to continue to become increasingly more important to our country as the demographic continues to shift and look very differently. And so how do we share those stories of the past, address them, but then also like empower this new sort of what will be leadership, stakeholders that will inevitably be not only sort of from a climate standpoint, incredibly important to sort of the livelihood of us as human beings, but also like for the sustainability of the park. So when you think about who's going to be the target audience that are going to go out and buy fishing licenses or going to sort of occupy campsites, like even from a, I guess, more business aspect, they're going to be sort of the target focus of a lot of these institutions. And I don't think that we're even actually thinking about that aspect of it as well. And so I think for me, in short, and I hope we continue to have this conversation, but just understanding that the conversation itself is important, because if we continue to ignore this any longer and not address it, we then sort of face a really harsh reality that these places are truly in deep risk of being ignored and disregarded, because for so long these populations have just been excluded from the conversation, but also physically from these spaces for such a long time.
Yeah, thank you so much. And what I'm hearing from both of you is that essentially we all have a relationship to the land. We all deserve that. We all should have access to this. And When you say that, I think it's also interesting because when we think about some of the popular images that we see about people in the outdoors, whether it's just advertising or in movies, we typically see a white woman, a white man, maybe accompanied with their children. It tends to be a very specific type of image we tend to see. But I know with the National Park Service, Reginald, that there's been a lot of work around trying to increase the diversity of park rangers, as well as retainment of the park rangers as well, and also finding ways to engage communities of color and make them really be able to actualize that ownership and agency that they have. I also can't miss the opportunity to plug the fact too that the oldest park ranger, Betty Reed Soskin, was a Black female civil rights activist who retired last year at 100 years old. She had been involved with NPS for over 15 years. I'm a fangirl. With that being said, what are some of the key issue areas that you're working on to address this related to diversity and inclusion? You've touched upon this a little bit, but we'd love to hear more. And then can you give us a sense of other sites and spaces that constitute the National Park Service outside of some of which you discussed already?
Sure. So let me see if I can start with, let's just start with Betty Reed Soskin. So she was at Rosie the Riveter. So if you've never actually looked her up, she is a spitfire. And so she's just wonderful to actually know. Let me see if I can back up just a little bit too, and just talk about the federal government and its workforce. Because I think when you talk about structural racism and you're starting to talk about, say, the National Park Service as an organization, you've got to look internally as well as externally, as you're talking about the outdoor recreation industry and the imagery that we see as well. So the National Park Service is about 78% white, and that is about 18.5% over the national average. And so say 60% white nationally. So when you begin to take a look at that, you begin to understand why certain decisions are made, and it's sometimes not intentional, but we just do what's familiar to us, which is why we need diversity to happen within the National Park Service. We've done a couple of things to address this. One, during the Obama administration, we had the 2016 centennial. And the centennial of the National Park Service, when we turned 100 years old, we had a couple of goals that were there, well, actually 3. But it was to diversify the workforce and the park goers, to actually have a younger population to actually begin to access the National Park Service, and then to actually build our social media content. And so if you see us online, we have a personality now. We're no longer that old, stodgy population. So what we learned during that process is we began doing studies, right? So we're this organization that has a lot of research that happens. What we learned is that our typical park goer was 65 to 75. It was a white couple. So what you can imagine, if you all have this reference, I don't know if everybody will have this reference, but the Brady Bunch, the parents have gotten older, and the kids are the ones who had the experience at the Park Service, and so they're gonna perpetuate the legacy of going to the national parks. But what we don't have are people of color who are in that same advantage point of being able to access and then pass on the legacy. So we really put a lot of work into actually having ambassadors that look like people of color, that people of color could respond to. So for the African American community, I don't know if this will land well with people either, but Terrence J, some of you may know him as a actor now, but he was also a VJ at the time on BET. But the linkages that you can't see that we were interested in is that he's a member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, which is the oldest black fraternity. And so he's a Q is what they would call it. So who else is a Q? Michael Jordan, Shaquille O'Neal, Colonel Charles Young, who was the first superintendent of Yosemite, and so a part of the Buffalo Soldiers. And so this becomes important to us in 2016, and we begin to shift and reach out to another kind of population and really change our brand to make sure that our brand is relevant. And so what Tyrhee is talking about is important. We won't have the next generation of park supporters, advocates, and visitors, and that was our tagline, is that we want to create that. And so I would like to think that we've built some momentum around that in 2016. Coming out of that, we had maybe 4 years of where that was no longer important. And so we had this big ramp up, and then we had this big 4-year letdown. And so what we have now is a new administration through those executive orders that I was talking about that is interested in that. And one of the things that I was happy to hear at the start of this forum is the land acknowledgement. And so just beginning there and understanding that we are on Native American land. And so that respect, and starting there and having our employees to begin to learn about that as well. So the internal work turned into external work. And so right now, if you look in the National Park Service, you will understand that we have a new DEIA strategy. And I'd like to just say shout out to the director, Chuck Sams, and our deputy directors, Mike Reynolds, Sean Binge, and really Lena McDowell, who is leading this effort, and it's called RISE. So it's, let me see, respectful, inclusive, I need my cheat sheet, hold on. Safe and engaged, and so RISE. And so this is our internal DEIA strategy, and it was tough. It was tough. I was serving on a leadership team at the time, and we had consultants to come in and really help us to shake ourselves up because we could see through those surveys that we weren't as relevant. But we had to change internally and begin to learn the language around white fragility, intersectionality. What is BIPOC? We had some members of the leadership team that didn't know what BIPOC was. And so it became important for us to learn the nomenclature so that we could then build the strategies that begin to impact the visitor community. And so that's where we are at this moment, kind of taking a look nationally to see, okay, are we on par with populations and where do we need to improve? Building those strategies internally and then building the systems for our staff to be able to understand that so we can turn the visitor experience into a more diverse one. And I think we're beginning to do that in different kinds of spaces. And so I talked about the National Mall. I think you can see this in some of the sites that are being nominated and approved through the Antiquities Act. Like we had 2 in the last 24 hours, one in Nevada related to the Native American community and another in Texas related to the Latino community. And so what you can see is that the effort is to really educate staff, do the special resource studies that need to be done, turn our lens to these communities that aren't here currently, and make these park sites that are relevant to them, relevant to us. Another is, say, Medgar Murley Evers. And so where in Jackson, Mississippi, that small little house where Medgar was gunned down now will become this kind of locus for that community, and it can do several things. It can be economic development, it can be tourism, it can be history, culture, and it can invite a whole other population that was not exposed to the National Park Service before. So we are natural, as Tyrhee has actually, a natural kind of community, thanks Tyrhee, a natural community, cultural, historical parks, we have national heritage areas, we have rivers and trails, so the Appalachian Trail is ours, the Statue of Liberty is ours, so there's all of these opportunities for us to really engage with these populations.
To that point too, because you mentioned the 78% of national parks being white, or the people being white, and to me that was resonates with something that we see on the Soul Trak Outdoors website, Tyrhee, your organization. So I quote from there, you, on your site says, African Americans make up 13% of the national population, but only about 7% of park visitors were Black. Latinos, Native Americans, and other non-white visitors are similarly underrepresented, and the rest, some 78%, are white. So how is your organization trying to tackle these statistics? And as far as your missions and key goals, how are those intervening into this issue and trying to make it a more inclusive space?
Yeah, so first I'm gonna start by, I think even Reggie in his position, just kind of, it's already helping work that I do really sort of break through the ceilings of like a very, very long sort of generation of, just exclusion. Like at the foundation, you think about Thomas Jefferson, John Muir, who are, they conceptualize, they manage the national parks, and to be quite honest, they were racist. And they were even eugenicists to some degree, and that the spaces themselves were created almost to like create this space for purity and cleanliness because urban spaces were sort of seen as dirty and populated by immigrants and people of color. And so at its very foundation, these environments weren't even meant for us. And so now we have leadership that sort of kind of started to penetrate systems that for a very long time have kind of really kept us out. And so just trying to really continue to push the barrier in terms of what inclusiveness looks like for the parks. You know, it takes a long time. There's huge initiatives that need to fall in place. And I live in DC. I work with local government systems. I work with the federal. And I know that that is a very, very long process. But when you think about, 200 years of that, that is a lot of untangling of systems that are not favorable to us. And so when we think about it, we try to start local. We can't fight a system that large in one push, right? And so even to some of the things that you were saying, even making spaces in our neighborhoods very relatable. DC, very privileged enough to be in a space that has a ton of local parks. We even have national parks within our city. And there's so much proximity to green space, but I think for so many people, there's still so much distance between their connection to those spaces that, again, are rooted in some of the things like, let's say 1952, when there was 180 national parks, Black people had access to 8 of them, right? And that is a very direct connection of like how we are sort of being, our bodies are being told and sort of control about where and how we can enjoy green space, how we can enjoy wellness. And that sort of moved up through the Jim Crow era where, then there were segregated parks. So we, again, are being told where and how we can enjoy those spaces. And you then even see it then now we're in our cities, like, even if there are parks 2 blocks away from our home, there still may be apprehension or just like cultural sort of programming that hasn't sort of allowed us to sort of move into those spaces very naturally. And I think our organization is trying to do work to give people that permission, give them that access, give them the tools to be able to exist and sort of enjoy those places. Because unfortunately, for such a long time, they've been told how and when they can do those things. And so just trying to get people a little bit more adjusted to like the new realities of where we are now. And it's still happening. You have Christian Cooper, you have Ahmaud Arbery, who are existing in natural space, whether that's running, whether that's bird watching, and people still feel the this power or this authority over us to say, hey, you can and you cannot do this. We are going to control how you exist in these spaces. And, that takes us a step back, right? And we have to then sort of come back and do the work to really build our communities back up to feel like, truly like the efforts that the national parks is trying to do are genuine and that our community is receptive to those things is, more from an infrastructural standpoint, but this is people work that I'm trying to do at Soul Trak is really connect to our communities, tell people, figure out what their concerns are, where their issues lie, and the benefit of being a very small organization like mine is that we can really try and address those issues very personally. And again, when you keep it very small and local, you can make those issues very personal in a way that say, like, how can this space, 2 blocks from you, become something that you care for, but also claim ownership over, right? Like these are tax-paying, like public spaces that they belong to you. And so how do you want to use this for time with your children? Do you want to use this for self-healing? Do you want to use this for recreation, fitness, wellness? Do you want to take care of it? And just kind of give people permission at a very small scale that then maybe continue to resonate much further to how I was speaking earlier, this much larger occupancy over spaces that we, for, again, a very long time have not had ownership over or didn't have that level of freeness to sort of exist. And so, yeah, our programs try and do the work that sort of really aligns or sort of meets these larger entities like the National Park Service midway and just like create a little bit more human nature to these more inclusive efforts.
Thank you so much. And I'm thinking too about the programming that we see at not just Soul Trak, of course, but also national parks. Reginald, you've pulled the curtain open a little bit. We're learning a lot. I'm learning a lot about just how extensive and how much work is being done by your organization, or our organization, I guess, since we... Yeah.
It's the royal hour.
You're
yes.
right, the royal we, yes. We do know that NPS provides a lot of grants and technical assistance to many NGOs and partners who provide programming, capital improvements, management of urban parks and historical sites. So in your work in these areas, how are you centering the voices of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other communities of color?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And so what I'll start with is the mission of the National Park Service. Often we hear that it is to preserve unimpaired for future generations. But there's another line in there, and it's that we do that with partners. And so what you will see is that there are a large number of grants that are available to the nonprofit community. And these are kind of the little hidden gems that I began to talk to Tyrhee about it backstage, so that we could begin to connect partners to the work of the National Park Service through funding as well. So some of the other groups that we work with are like Outdoor Afro with RUMAP, or Hispanic Access Foundation, and they have Latino Conservation Week. And so there are these groups that we want to naturally just work with, and we can develop memorandums of understanding with them to talk about what it is that we want to accomplish together. And then we can move into another relationship that if we have funding, we can actually move funding to you in a cooperative agreement, or we can actually go after funding together. So where we go to a foundation and say, we'd like to actually move the needle on something. And so we want change to happen, both change in behavior and change in condition. And so we've done that collectively with different kinds of nonprofits. Then we also have our National Park Foundation, which is our congressionally chartered foundation that works across all national parks, and we have 212 friends groups that then work directly with the national parks. So we'll have like the Cuyahoga Conservancy for Cuyahoga National Park in Ohio, or in Cleveland, Ohio. So there's these opportunities to partner with the National Park Service, which is the work that I do, but partnerships actually are across the entire Park Service. So if you go to the superintendent of, let's pick a park, say the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is working locally. The superintendent is charged through their evaluation to work on partnerships, say with the Native American community that is there, with the concessions community that is there, with the political community that is there, and then with just the local residents. And so what you find is that we're not an island, but we are trying to actually connect to the other parts of, say, cities, counties, municipalities, and really create a robustness that actually leverages dollars that are there, or leverages energy that's there, or connects with folks who actually want to bring other populations into national parks. And so I think there's more of that is happening than there is some of the kind of sentiment that you see that it's not happening. And I think there's folks in the audience today like Teresa Robertson Clark. Yes, Tracy Robertson Clark. That was good, right? That was good. So tell Pedro I almost got it right. So in Everglades, right? And so there's arts work that's going on as well. And so there's this local energy that you see that we're getting it done there, but that is not always the national story.
Also, too, Tyrhee, outside of your organization, Soul Trak, we see other ways that you're also engaged in trying to make inroads of racial diversity in the outdoors. So, for instance, it was mentioned during the introduction, being part of the first all-Black team to descend Denali, which I want to mention, if you haven't seen All American Descent, please do. I've seen it 3 times. I first saw it at the Roxbury Film Festival, and I took everything I had to stand up and be like, yes, during the entire film. But also, you're a brand ambassador for Eddie Bauer and for REI. So can you say more about the significance of these efforts and what impact there has been?
Yeah, for sure. I just would start by saying that there's a huge significance in my expedition with Denali in the fact that it was a film, and just kind of really displaying this visual representation of Black people in these very, very extreme environments that is essentially in places that even very few humans get to have access to, but then a population that to some degree is still working very proactively to even get access to, how I mentioned, even local spaces that they are within their communities. And one of the reasons why I'm involved in things like Eddie Bauer or even sit on the board of the DC Environmental Film Festival is because one of the major things that I feel like we've lost is the stories of Black people, or the visual sort of representation that exists, that I think plays a huge role in, again, in sort of the absence of attendance that we sort of are working to regenerate. And so there has been stories like the Buffalo Soldiers that have existed and sort of played a huge role in not only the protection and development of our national parks, but even in the stories of recreation, like some of these historic Black beaches that we've sort of seen in places like Maryland and Florida, where, you know, having those stories told and showing how there is enjoyment, there has been recreation, there has been sort of this occupation of these different spaces, I think will help and give people that validation, give them the permission that they need. And so for me, being able to be in a position where I can help highlight and sort of share the stories of our current enthusiasts and folks that sort of take advantage, kind of make up for some of the lost ground that I feel like we've been robbed of, right? Because I think storytelling really sort of, it sort of dictates what the future holds for your community. And one of my really good friends, James Mills, who's a journalist, is working with Nat Geo to go into the national parks to, and I think he's like trying to go to every single national park and capture Black history, like Black stories in these parks, because if you go to the Grand Canyon, you may sort of come across 20, 30 different signs that will let you know the indigenous history, the geological history of those places, but you may not be told the stories of the first Black experiences or some of the major historical Black experiences that have happened in those places that could really change the entire experience for someone who may be encountering those spaces for the very first time. And I think that part of, for me, is incredibly important, because I think we live in a very digital age where stories, both visually, both through photograph, through blogs, are incredibly important to everyone in terms of how they see or view the world, right? And for me, I think just being in positions where I can help elevate the stories of the people around me, both myself and others, and even folks like Reggie, I think really helps give permission people the understanding that, hey, you could be a leader in our national park system, right? And like, you can sort of occupy roles like this. And for such a long time, you may not know that. I was on a panel 3 days ago with the first Black woman, Melanie, who of the Forest Service, and she had also the longest serving person in the National Forest Service. And I had never heard about her story. And she lives in DC. And that's a story that I think many other Black women should know. I think that they all should be able to see and hear her experience, understanding that that is a place where Black women exist. But unfortunately, her story hasn't been told yet. And trying to get those stories in front of so many of my community members is something that I think is sort of one of the key sort of steps to moving our communities forward.
Yeah, I agree. It's so key. Basically, you're making the argument, which is true, that like we've always been here when it comes to the outdoors, and so and show that and that reclaim that representation. Such important work. Before we go to the last question, we're going to be opening up to the Q&A portion of the forum in a few minutes. So there's microphones located here, and here, up there in the Loge area. So when you can feel free to start lining up for your questions. We do ask people to make sure that your question is a question and not a statement. And then to please identify yourself as well and provide your university affiliation as you're lining up. And no speeches, please, again, just end with a question. So before we open up to that, for our last question, the last minute or two we have here, I also want to ask about inclusion, kind of expanding beyond just looking at race. So for myself as someone who finds intersectionality to be really key and important in my work in the world. When we're talking about racial inclusion, we also have to think about other systems of power, right? So whether we're talking about sexism or ableism, classism, ageism, cis heterosexism, when we really want to include everyone, we have to think about all those things to represent everyone's needs. So that being said, for both of you, and I'll start again with you, Reginald, in what ways do we see the National Park Service trying to take into account all these different groups and different systems of systemic power, rather systems of discrimination, I should say, and trying to counter that and make it a more inclusive space for everyone, regardless of identity?
Well, yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's an important one. And so I'll do the internal, then external piece once again. So internally, we have employee resource groups that have really begun to take hold. And so we've got disability access, Latino. I'm in charge of the African American as well as the champion for the LGBTQIA group. We have the Asian American group, Asian Pacific Islander group. And so what you can begin to see is that internally we're trying to do the work of both supporting our communities as well as building strategies for them to to understand how to then provide customer service that is inclusive as well to the visitor population. In terms of the outpicturing externally, what we're trying to do is to put people of color in positions of, say, superintendency or leadership within the National Park Service. And so if you go to, say, the National Mall, the area known as the National Capital Parks East, or NACE, which is inclusive of Frederick Douglass, Carter G. Woodson, and the Asala Legacy, the George Washington Memorial Parkway. It's just this great combination of parks. It's run by Tara Morrison, who's an African American. We've got Great Smoky with Cassius Cash, African American, actually from Tennessee, and that park spans both Tennessee and North Carolina. And so what you begin to see is leadership, that you have an outpicturing, so as Tyrhee is saying, that populations can see themselves in that leadership and they feel welcome to come into those spaces. And those leaders then understand how to recruit a diverse population to both work there. And then in the case of like Cassius Cash, who you've got the Gatlinburg fire that happens, and then him working with the local community to rebuild, and what that took to actually do some real work that actually is across racial boundary lines, that there's a history of structural racism there, and there's an African American leading this big rebuilding effort. And that park is one of our most visited, and it's the park with the most flora and fauna. So it's important to have a person like Cash there to be able to represent everything that we're talking about internally, that it gets outpictured externally, and we begin to pull folks in, and he begins to pull in folks that are kind of breaking the chain. The way you get into the Park Service typically was that you would actually begin as a seasonal, and seasonals tend to happen right around a park. And so if that park population was white, you get a white seasonal who then begins to work their career from a GS 5, 7, 9, 11, 12, 13, 15, and maybe even senior executive service or director of the Park Service. So there's this chain, and so breaking that chain and beginning to work with groups like Tyree's Soul Trak or Greening Youth Foundation and bringing in HBCUI students, or Hispanic Access Foundation and bringing in fellows who've graduated from university, who are looking for their next job and can actually see a career in the National Park Service and begin to help us build those programs that create access. And so that's what it is that we're doing that you can't see, but if you connect the dots, you will begin to see that we're trying to be relevant, to make sure that the most diverse population that we're going to ever have in the United States begins to own the National Park Service, which is theirs, and that we see as folks are retiring out, that we're beginning to actually fill those positions with diversity that's necessary in the Park Service.
Yeah, I would say one of the greatest things about starting something like Soul Trak is that naturally my community expands further than Soul Trak itself. I've been connected to many other leaders like Latino Outdoors, Stonewall Climbing, Brown Girls Climb. And I think the power of that is that you realize that this effort is something that we all have to come together on, or that work becomes so much harder. And so being able to sort of then be brought into their realities, their worlds, we can then sort of address a lot of our collective issues together, whether that's getting Braille added to the signage in the rock climbing gym, or getting Spanish translations in our national parks for our Latin visitors, and just starting to come together as a much larger community to create a much wider perspective of what this new norm will look like for us moving forward. And so I think just naturally for me, when you sort of do inclusive work like this, you naturally think about others and who else sort of are dealing with the similar issues that you sort of found that have brought you to where you are now, and you want to sort of get their perspective, understand their challenges. And for me, that sort of happened through my leadership, but also through the actual communities that we work with. And that happens through collaboration. A lot of our events and programs will be in collaboration with a lot of these partners to, again, just widen our reach. All of our goals innately is to sort of touch and create opportunities for more people to be able to be brought into these spaces. And so if that means being able to sort of approach a women-led organization and get their community members to be a part of something that we can sort of facilitate for a large group of people, that's a win for us, and it also is a win for them. And so, yeah, I think that just when you're in a space that sort of is trying to create more inclusion for everyone, or even a specific demographic, you then think about how that can sort of extend further to others.
Thank you so much. So let's go ahead and open it up to questions. So we'll work our way around the room. And again, as a reminder, to identify yourself and provide your university affiliation. So we will start here right on the right and work our way around.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I feel like it was super interesting and informative. My name's Serena. I'm a sophomore at the college. And over this past spring break, I had a chance to go on over to Old North Bridge and the Minuteman National Historic Site. And that made me think about how these parks and sites are not just places to recreate, but they are also the caretakers of our national history. And I think a lot of conversation recently has been about how institutional narratives of history often leave out things like structural racism and the injustices that have been perpetuated throughout American history. So I guess I was hoping you could speak a little more to the signage and the educational aspects of the parks and possibly how they're addressing topics of structural racism as teaching places.
Sure, so I'll take that one to start. So what you will see, I'll give you an example of what we're planning towards and tell you a little bit about some of the stuff that's going on. So in 2026, we're going to celebrate the semi-sesquicentennial of the United States, right? So we'll be, 250 years old? And so we are in this partnership with the Mellon Foundation right now. And so we got a $14.6 million grant that my office helped write with the National Park Foundation. And what we'll do is we'll have fellows to come out and talk, to actually do work, so postdoctoral fellows who will actually come and actually go to a park and uncover the stories that aren't there. And so what we'll do is then use that research to inform our interpretation of that site, and it'll go to our interpretive staff. So when I say interpretive staff, that's the ranger that you meet that has the badge on and their name, and that comes up to you with the Unigrid, that black kind of book that unfolds and tells you all about the park, and you can go on a tour with them. So that person will have new stories to tell, and that will then go into our social media as well, so it will change there. And so what you will begin to see is that the stories will go out, and then that then has a reverberating effect as well, where we then, our budgets then plan towards telling more of those stories, and so it begins to be more of a ripple effect. I think some other stuff that we're doing is we got a 9-page policy memo from our director, Chuck Sams, to talk about co-stewardship in national parks, and so really working with native populations, native nations that are right around a park or in a park on shared decision making according to law, making sure that they are involved not just in a transaction with us, say with tribal consultation, but really on making key decisions for both the land and the programming that's happening there. And so that's some of the stuff that's happening so that we can unpack and really just destroy the structure and be rebuilding the way that it should be or should have been all the time in a national park.
Question up there at the top.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming and speaking with us today. My name is Josh Rosenblum. I'm a first year at the college. My question is mostly for Tyrhee, but if Reginald, you have thoughts, I'd love to hear them as well. But Tyrhee, given that you are a brand ambassador for Eddie Bauer and REI, I'm curious what you think that the role of outdoor brands is, if there is one at all, in making the outdoors a more accessible space for all people?
Yeah, I think outdoor brands play a very significant role in like representation of what the outdoors look like, right? So how you spoke earlier about magazines displaying, you know, like a white couple out on a camping trip, or sort of climbers on the side of this really steep wall. Again, we respond very explicitly to what we see and like how we envision ourselves. Like we want to sort of connect ourselves to the imagery around us. And, you know, a lot of that is, who's at the forefront of a lot of those pictures are our brands. We connect to the North Face, which I would say is probably one of the most prominent sort of outdoor brands, right? And how, you know, they will sort of create the narrative that we sort of then follow around how we exist, what we sort of see as extreme, what we may even see as sort of the outdoors in itself, right? Like, what do you think about when you think of the outdoors? Is it going to a place like Yosemite National Park, or is it going to, you know, your local state park, right? And how, for me, connecting to those stakeholders, that was one of the first things I did when I sort of started Soul Trak, is I approached who I seen as the folks that had the biggest stake in the space, right? Like who kind of made the decisions around who were going to be our next generation of outdoor inhabitants. And those people were the folks that I felt like were creating the visual narrative of that. And that came through outdoor magazines. It came through the different, you know, brick and mortar sort of storefronts that I would see that sort of painted the picture of things like traditional outings like camping, climbing, paddling. And yeah, I think once you can penetrate something like that, how do you sort of attach other folks to sort of that narrative? And for me, it's being able to, I've been very lucky enough to have a community that I could then say, hey, Eddie Bauer, this isn't just for me. I want you to sort of support not only my experience, but my organization's experience that can tell the story of not just one, but dozens of other people's experience outdoors. So hopefully that it doesn't not only become like, oh, a Black person can be outdoors, but this much more sort of less restrictive identity of like what race looks like, but just the human aspect of people of color that can exist outdoors. Because I'm naturally inclined to be outside, but there could be a different way of spending time outdoors. It can be my grandma who just wants to be outside with her grandchild for the evening, and tell that story of how she's utilizing that space is really important to me. And so, yeah, I think for me, just being able to connect to brands like that allows me to bring other stories up and put into the forefront of what I believe is one of the major generators of how we're going to move forward in sort of public space.
Over here at the top.
Hi, my name's Alma. I'm a senior at the college. And my question is about the entrance fees. Some parks are free, but some can be up to like $35, and this can be a barrier to entry for some people. I understand we don't want bumper-to-bumper traffic, and maybe like the cost helps upkeep of the park, but just what do you think are the benefits and negatives of entrance admissions?
So Tyrhee, is that for you or is that for
I can start, but I mean, I agree. I think that it definitely is a barrier, especially just in my position. Again, a lot of times at this stage, I am not only getting myself outdoors, it's how do I get 30 people outdoors, and how does that create a barrier, or how does that impact their ability to sort of experience those spaces? And like you said, I think it has a two-sided effect, right? Those funds do inevitably go and maintain those spaces, but on the other end, it's how does that sort of create an open door, or is this a public space? Is this sort of accessible to everyone? And to me, I think we're starting to see this happen in other aspects of sort of outdoor space, where there is sort of a pay if you can or pay if you will sort of model that I think could essentially be replicated in spaces where I've seen, for the most part, where there is a fee. Typically, that correlates to sort of where that park is for most cases. Like obviously, especially in DC at least, most of the national parks that do have a fee are typically in areas that are already pretty inaccessible to a lot of the communities that would sort of possibly need to sort of, or would appreciate the free entry that could potentially be allowed there. But I think that for me, it seems like that. And with the communities I work with primarily, it serves more as a barrier than it does a benefit to the national parks, because it prevents them from being able to be there and experience the space.
Sure, and I thank you for that perspective. I'll just add on just a little bit to that. So we are aware that it can be a barrier to entry. And so some of the things that we're working on now, or well, some of the things that we have that we try to make up for that in some ways are fee-free days. And so you can check our calendar, and so there are times during the year that there are fee-free days that you can actually go to those national parks. Shortly, you will actually see us roll out a program where we're working with a couple of rideshare companies to really test pilot some ways of actually getting into national parks that can be a bit discounted. And so we are trying to solve for the transportation issue, the entrance fee once you get there, and then how do you prepare folks? Because there is, if you're doing climbing or you're doing hiking, there's certain gear that you need, and we need you to have that gear because we don't want to overtax our search and rescue teams to come and actually get you off the cliff or off the ledge or to mend your ankle. And so there are certain things that are there, but we are aware of that, and we're trying to work on those issues at the same time of trying to preserve our national parks, and it costs. So if you, and this is not an indictment of anyone, but the National Park Service budget has been about $3 billion for about 10 years. And so there's not an adjustment for inflation there, and there's been inflections of cash at different points in time. And so we're using those moments that Congress are giving us, and with that inflection of cash, of looking at what else can we do to make the visitor experience a bit more affordable.
So we have time for one more question in the last 3 minutes that we have here. So I will take the one that's over here.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm Kendall Ernst. I'm a second year at the business school. I'm a proud Soul Trak member. And my question was, I'm working on an outdoor business, actually, so to go to the brand piece. But I'm particularly interested in trends and how you're seeing trends change, and if there are kind of green shoots of more people of color going in the outdoors, and even if that is different, broken into different segments of Black versus Latino versus other folks.
So I'll start with that one. So I will say that there is a trend. We're not tracking the trend as we could. It's just because of just legalities of us being able to do that kind of survey work, but we would work with an outside organization like Soul Trak to really help us to begin to understand what that looks like. But we are seeing this in our national parks where there are groups of Black women who are showing up in national parks and hiking. We are seeing LGBTQ groups to actually show up and hike and feel safe. We are seeing Latino groups organize themselves and go across the country to actually go into the outdoors. And so there is a bit of a movement that is happening, and we want to encourage more of that. We can't necessarily quantify it at this point in time, but we are working with we have a science department too. They are working on a new survey so that we can begin to actually track that. And when we begin to track it internally, we begin to actually create systems that encourage more of that activity to happen in the National Park Service. So I'm excited about that work that is happening, but it's mostly happening through our partner groups at this point, whether it's a Soul Trak or it's one of our friends groups in national parks. They are the ones that are really bringing in that kind of diversity and really encouraging access to the outdoors.
Yeah, I would say similarly, especially in the past few years, particularly through the pandemic, where I think people experience a much more, far more, where they sort of needed things to be, where you're seeing a spike. But I would say the most sustained has actually been Black Women, our organization. The participation is over 85% Black women who sort of occupy a lot of our programs, a lot of our leadership cohorts, and just sort of that, I can't really necessarily connect that to anything in particular, but we've just sort of seen that be one of our most consistent sort of populations within the organization. And I would say that another reality of trends is that they typically follow sort of major sort of life occurrences. So whether it's a pandemic, whether it's sort of things like gentrification within a city, and we've sort of tried to sort of brace ourselves for this new economic reality that we are headed towards, and are sort of trying to figure out how that may impact our participation, what demographics may falter because of that. And so we're a relatively young organization. We've been around for 5 years, so trends is kind of like a hard thing to measure at this stage. But I think that we're starting to try and collect as much data from participants, whether that is pronouns, identity, sort of what parts of the city individuals live in, to hopefully, in 10 years be able to follow and track some of the sort of patterns that we see through the folks that come in and out of our organization.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you both for just wonderful answers and enlightening everyone here. Thank you all for attending as well this evening. And that concludes our forum.